The pink and blue balloons were still floating when I walked through the door of my own house and found 40 strangers eating my food, drinking my liquor, and celebrating a baby that absolutely was not mine. My wife Nicole had told me she was pregnant. 8 weeks along, she said, glowing in that way women glow when they deliver news that's supposed to completely change your life forever. And it did change my life. Just not the way either of us expected. I held her face in my hands, kissed her forehead, and told her I loved her. I went to bed that night feeling like a man who genuinely had everything. A beautiful wife, a house we'd built together over 6 years of marriage, a business I'd grown from absolutely nothing, and now a child on the way. What I didn't tell Nicole, what I hadn't told anyone yet because I was still processing it myself, was that months earlier my doctor had sat across from me in his office, cleared his throat, and told me that the results of my fertility testing were conclusive. Azoospermia. 0 sperm count. Not low. 0. I was completely, medically, and irreversibly infertile. Had been, according to the specialist I saw afterward, likely for years, possibly since my early 20s, due to a condition that had gone completely undiagnosed my entire adult life. I hadn't told Nicole yet because I was still figuring out how to actually have that conversation. We'd been casually trying for a baby for about a year. Nothing desperate, nothing clinical, just the natural assumption that it would happen when it happened. I was going to tell her. I had an appointment scheduled with a counselor to help us navigate the news together. I was handling it the way a man handles hard things. Carefully, responsibly, with a solid plan. And then Nicole told me she was pregnant. I did the math that same night, lying in the dark while she slept right beside me with her hand resting on her still flat stomach. I am infertile. She is pregnant. Those two facts absolutely cannot coexist if I am the father. I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for 7 hours and felt something inside me, something that had taken 6 years to build, begin to crack straight at the foundation. I didn't confront her immediately. I know that surprises some people when I tell this story. They expect me to say I lost my mind or drove through the night in a full-blown rage. But I'm not built that way. I think before I act. I gather before I strike. My father raised me to be precise, not reckless. So instead of blowing everything up on raw emotion alone, I did something a whole lot smarter. I called my doctor the next morning and requested a formal written report of my test results. Official, signed, dated, on clinic letterhead. I had it in my hands within 48 hours. I read it 3 times. I put it in a manila envelope and locked it in my desk drawer at the office. And I waited. I watched. I paid attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Because when you love someone completely, you stop looking for cracks. You assume the structure is solid. You stop checking. I started checking. I went back through months of phone records on our shared plan. I found a number that appeared repeatedly. Late nights, early mornings, lunch hours when she told me she was stuck in meetings. The number wasn't saved under any name in her phone. But I'm a businessman. I know people. I had a contact run the number. It came back to a man named Derek, 34 years old. Personal trainer. Worked at the upscale gym Nicole had joined 8 months ago. 8 months. Right around the time we'd started casually trying for a baby. I didn't call Derek. I didn't confront Nicole. I just sat with it, cold and burning at the same time. The way only real betrayal feels. Like swallowing something simultaneously frozen and on fire. 6 years. We had built 6 years together. I remembered the night she cried at her father's funeral, and I held her for 4 hours without moving. I remember driving through a snowstorm to pick her up when her car broke down on the highway at midnight. I remembered the weekend we painted the nursery. The nursery? Good God. We'd painted it 2 years ago just because we were optimistic, because we were completely in love, because we thought we were the kind of couple that actually lasted. And now this. She started planning the gender reveal party without consulting me at all. That alone should have registered as deeply strange. Nicole was meticulous about including me in everything. Or she used to be, before guilt started making people behave in ways that seemed just slightly off if you're paying any kind of real attention. She said she wanted it to be a surprise for me too. You'll find out the gender the same time as everyone else, she said, touching my arm with a familiarity that now felt like pure performance. I said that sounded wonderful. I smiled. I meant absolutely neither. What Nicole had no idea about was that 2 days before the party, I had visited a private medical testing facility across the city, one that offered non-invasive prenatal paternity testing. I had submitted my DNA sample along with documentation of Nicole's pregnancy from the OB records I'd accessed through our shared medical account. They told me results would take 5 to 7 business days. They came back in 4. The results confirmed exactly what I already knew. I was not the father. The probability was listed at 0%. The report was thorough, clinical, and absolute. I printed 2 copies. One went into the manila envelope with my infertility report. The other I folded neatly and placed in the interior pocket of the jacket I planned to wear to the party. I got dressed that Saturday afternoon like a man going to a business meeting he fully intends to win. The house smelled like catered food and fresh flowers when I pulled up. I could hear music through the front windows, something upbeat and festive. There were cars parked along both sides of our street, way more than I'd expected. Nicole had told me it would be small, intimate, close family and friends. Instead, I counted at least a dozen cars I didn't even recognize, and several I did. Her mother's SUV, her sister's sedan, people from her work, people from our neighborhood, and presumably Derek somewhere in that crowd, though I didn't know that for certain yet. I walked in through the front door of my own house without knocking. The living room had been completely transformed. Pink and blue balloons in clusters, streamers, a table covered in themed food, and a banner that read, "He or she, wait and see." And in the center of it all, my wife was standing in a white sundress, laughing at something someone had just said, one hand resting on the small swell of her stomach that was only just beginning to show. She saw me, and her expression shifted. Something flashed across her face that she recovered from fast, replaced quickly with a smile that didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. "James, you're early." "Am I?" I looked around the room. Seems like I'm exactly on time. People turned to look at me. I recognized Nicole's mother, Linda, near the food table, and her sister Vanessa by the window. Some of her work colleagues stood in a cluster near the kitchen doorway, and then I saw him standing near the back wall with a drink in his hand. Well-built, early 30s, looking like a man who hadn't quite decided whether to stay or run. Derek. He didn't know who I was yet. I could tell by the way he held his ground. I knew absolutely everything. Nicole came toward me, arms opening for a hug, still performing. "I'm so glad you're here," she said. I let her hug me because I was still completely in control of this situation, and being in control meant not moving until the moment was exactly right. "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. I put my hand on the small of her back and smiled at the room. Wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. The next 30 minutes were the most disciplined of my entire life. I shook hands. I accepted food I didn't eat. I made small talk I didn't mean. I watched Derek watching Nicole. And I watched Nicole carefully not watching Derek, in the very specific way people don't watch someone they're absolutely desperate not to be caught watching. The geometry of their guilt was completely visible to me now that I knew exactly where to look. He stood at angles that kept her in his peripheral vision at all times. She moved through the room with the unconscious awareness of precisely where he was. I watched all of it and said nothing and waited. The reveal was set for the back garden. 60-odd people crowded around a table with a large white box sitting on it. Inside, according to tradition, colored balloons would float out when opened. Nicole stood at the table beaming, and someone handed her an actual microphone, because apparently we were doing this at full production value. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice warm and practiced. "This baby is already so loved, and I'm so grateful. I'd like to say something." My voice cut clean across the garden. Every single head turned. Nicole's smile froze solid. I walked through the crowd, which parted for me without me having to ask, and I stepped up right beside the table. I looked at Nicole first, directly, completely without flinching, and I watched her face go from frozen to genuinely afraid in the span of 2 full seconds. Then I looked out at the crowd. "Most of you know me," I said. "I'm James, Nicole's husband. The man who's been working 80-hour weeks to pay for this house, this party, this catered food, and everything else that makes this life look the way it does." I kept my voice steady. Not loud, not shaking, just clear. "I have 2 documents in my pocket. I'd like to share them because I think they're highly relevant to this celebration." "James." Nicole's voice was a warning wrapped in a desperate plea. "Please don't." "The first," I said, reaching into my jacket, "is a certified medical report from a specialist fertility clinic." I unfolded it and held it up, then set it flat on the table where anyone nearby could see it clearly. It confirms that I have azoospermia, zero sperm count. I am completely infertile. I cannot father children. This has been the case medically for an estimated 3 to 5 years. The garden went silent in the specific way that only genuine shock produces. Not the polite quiet of a pause. The airless, total silence of 60 people absorbing something that simply does not compute. The second document, I continued, unfolding the second paper with the exact same unhurried precision, is the result of a prenatal paternity test conducted 4 days ago. It confirms with absolute certainty that I am not the father of the baby Nicole is currently carrying. Nicole's hand flew to her mouth. Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. "What?" Linda, her mother, said out loud. "Oh my God," loud enough for the entire garden to hear. I set both documents side by side on the table right next to the gender reveal box and stepped back. "So I'm not entirely sure whose baby we're celebrating today," I said. "But it isn't mine." Nicole had started crying. Not the graceful, photogenic kind of crying. The ugly, collapsing kind. The kind that happens when everything a person has been desperately holding together falls at once. "James, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me, Nicole." I looked at her with something I genuinely hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not rage, not satisfaction, just an enormous and completely permanent clarity. "I already know. I've known for a while. I just wanted everyone else to know too." I looked across the garden and found Derek, who was absolutely no longer standing casually against the wall. He was standing completely rigid, face pale, holding his drink like it was the only fixed point left in the universe. Our eyes met. He looked away first. "Whoever the father is," I said to the general crowd, "he's welcome to the house too, since I won't be needing it." I picked up both documents from the table, folded them back into my jacket, and turned to Nicole's mother, who was standing with tears streaming down her face and her hands pressed together like she was praying. "Linda, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I genuinely mean that." Then I walked back through the crowd, through the house, and straight out the front door. I sat in my car for exactly 4 minutes. Not because I needed to compose myself. I was composed. I sat because I wanted to fully feel the weight of that moment before I drove away from it. 6 years, a house, a life gone. And I was the one who'd ended it with 2 pieces of paper and 30 seconds of controlled speech. And somewhere behind me in the garden I'd built and the home I'd paid for, my wife was standing next to a gender reveal box full of balloons in the color of a child that was never mine. I drove to my office, not because I had work to do on a Saturday afternoon, but because the office was entirely mine, built by my own effort alone, carrying none of her presence, and I needed a space that was completely clean of her. I sat at my desk, called my attorney, and had him on the phone within 20 minutes. Divorce proceedings were initiated. I had a forensic accountant reviewing our joint finances. I moved the proprietary accounts from our shared banking over to a business account in my name alone. All of it entirely legal. All of it exactly what my attorney advised. Nicole tried to call me 11 times that Saturday night. I watched the phone light up with her name and felt absolutely nothing that resembled any urge to pick up. Her sister Vanessa texted me, "James, please call us. She wants to explain." I responded once. "My attorney will be in touch." I didn't respond again after that. My older brother Raymond showed up at my apartment that night with a bottle of scotch and the good sense not to say anything stupid. Raymond was 10 years older than me, an ex-military man with a quiet authority I'd always deeply respected. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, poured 2 glasses, and said, "How are you holding up?" "Clearly," I said. He nodded. "Good." He drank. "What do you need?" "Help going through the financials. And someone to have a conversation with Derek." Raymond set his glass down and looked at me with the particular stillness that meant he was listening completely. "What kind of conversation?" "The legal kind. I want him to understand that there are potential legal consequences to his involvement in this situation, depending on what was said to Nicole about his relationship status." I had already found out through the same contact who'd identified Derek's number that Derek was in a long-term relationship with a woman named Amanda who had a 5-year-old daughter. She had absolutely no idea about Nicole. Of course she didn't. Amanda deserved to know. "I'll handle it," Raymond said. He did. By Sunday evening, Amanda had been informed. Not by me, not with any drama, but through a quiet and factual conversation that gave her the information she needed to make her own decisions. I heard later that Derek came home that Sunday night to find his belongings in the hallway and a note on the door. I didn't celebrate it. It wasn't about Derek. It was about a woman who simply deserved the truth. Nicole's mother, Linda, called me the following Monday. Linda was a decent woman, and I had always genuinely liked her, which made this considerably harder. She cried for the first 2 minutes. I let her. When she stopped, she said, "James, I am so sorry. I had no idea." "I know, Linda. This isn't anything you did. She wants to talk to you. She says she wants to explain." "There's nothing she can explain that changes the outcome," I said. Not cruelly, just honestly. Nicole made choices. I'm making mine. The marriage is over. A long silence. "I understand." That was the last conversation I had with anyone from Nicole's family. What followed was 3 months of the most focused, productive work I had done in years. I know that sounds strange. I know people expect the story to include a period of devastation, so complete it completely flattens you. Sleepless nights, missed meals, emotional wreckage. There was some of that, privately. I'd be straight up lying if I said there weren't evenings in that furnished apartment where the quiet became louder than it should have been, where I sat with a drink and thought about the version of my life I'd expected to be living. The nursery we'd painted. The name we'd half-jokingly argued about. The future that had been built on a foundation I hadn't known was completely hollow. But grief, in my experience, is not something you perform. It's something you feel in your own time, and then you get up and you work. And I worked. The divorce was finalized in just over 3 months. Nicole didn't contest anything meaningful once she understood that my attorney had been completely thorough and my documentation was airtight. The house was sold. I took my share and immediately reinvested it into a commercial property I'd had my eye on for 2 years. The business, which had been quietly growing for years, suddenly had my full undivided attention for the very first time, and it responded the way things respond when you give them absolutely everything. It doubled its revenue in a single quarter. I hired 2 new team members. I closed 3 contracts I'd been dancing around for months. I rebuilt my physical routine. 5 mornings a week in the gym. The kind of consistent, serious training that produces real visible results in 60 days. I cut alcohol almost entirely. I slept 8 hours a night with a discipline I'd never previously applied to sleep. By month 4, I barely recognized myself in photographs. And I mean that in the absolute best possible way. The softness that comfortable married life had gradually deposited had been replaced by something harder and cleaner. My clothes fit completely differently. I stood differently. People in meetings started commenting on it. Not on what had happened, but on the version of me that was now sitting in front of them. My close friend Daniel, who had known me since university, met me for lunch and just stared at me across the table for a full minute before speaking. "You look like you just came out the other side of an actual war," he said. "I did," I told him. "And I won." He grinned. "Good. I want to be specific about one thing because it genuinely matters. I didn't reconstruct myself as some kind of revenge against Nicole. I reconstructed myself because I had spent 6 years unconsciously organizing my entire life around a partnership that had turned out to be completely fictional. And when that structure was removed, what remained was the original version of me. The one who had built everything from scratch before she was ever in the picture. And he was, frankly, better equipped than I'd remembered. The business recognition came eventually. I was shortlisted for a regional business award in my industry, something I'd been in the orbit of for 2 years without quite landing. This year, I was the recipient. The ceremony was a black tie event at a hotel downtown. I went alone, sat at my table with 2 of my team members, and when they called my name, I walked to that stage and shook the presenter's hand and said, "Thank you," into the microphone and meant every single syllable. My team posted a photo afterward to the company page. The comments were full of congratulations from clients, partners, colleagues. One of the very first comments was from Linda, Nicole's mother, who wrote simply, "Proud of you, James. Always will be." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went to celebrate with my team. It was a few weeks after the awards ceremony that Nicole resurfaced. I was coming out of a coffee shop on a Thursday morning carrying 2 cups, one for me and one for the architect I was meeting about the commercial property renovation, when I nearly walked straight into her on the pavement outside. She looked exhausted. That was the first thing I noticed, even before the bump, which was substantial now, was the sheer exhaustion she wore on her face like bad weather. She wasn't falling apart in any visible way, but the shine was completely gone. The performance was gone. She just looked like a tired, frightened woman who had done something she absolutely could not undo. I stopped walking. She stopped too. We stood on the pavement with the morning crowd moving around us and looked at each other for the first time since I'd walked out of our garden. "James," she said. "Nicole." I shifted the coffees in my hands. "You look tired." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I am." She looked at my face, then quickly away. "You look," she stopped. "How are you doing?" I asked, because I'm a human being and she was visibly struggling and I was never built to be needlessly cruel. Her jaw moved. "Derek's not involved. It doesn't matter. I'm handling it." She pressed her lips together. "I hear you won the award." Raymond told my mother. "I did." Another silence. She looked at my face again, longer this time, and I could see exactly what she was doing. She was taking full inventory of what she'd thrown away. The way people do when they have no more arguments left to make and only pure regret remaining. Her eyes were shining. "I'm so sorry," she said. The words came out completely stripped of everything. No strategy, no angle, just the bare naked fact of them. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything." She touched her stomach, almost involuntarily. "I just needed to say it to your face." I looked at her for a long moment. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, but with the specific and permanent neutrality of a man who has already made complete peace with something and genuinely does not need to revisit it. "I hope you and the baby do well," I said. And I meant it in the limited way that you can mean something when it no longer involves you in any way. "Take care of yourself, Nicole." I walked past her, crossed the street, and did not look back. That evening I sat in my apartment, a nicer one now, one I'd chosen entirely for myself with high ceilings and a view of the city and no decorative choices made by any kind of compromise, and I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, poured one glass, and sat by the window. I thought about the version of myself that had stood in that garden and placed 2 documents on a table right next to a gender reveal box. I thought about how crystal clear everything had been in that moment. Not just Nicole's betrayal, but the 6 years of accommodation. The gradual erosion of the man I'd been before the marriage. The way love can become, if you're not careful, a kind of slow disappearing act. I wasn't angry anymore. I hadn't been angry in months. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more powerful. The deep, settled satisfaction of a man who had been handed the absolute worst possible situation and had responded with precision, dignity, and complete purpose. I had not begged. I had not broken. I had not allowed someone else's catastrophic failure of character to become my own catastrophic failure of self. I had gathered the facts. I had acted at exactly the right moment. I had ended it cleanly. And I had built something genuinely better from the wreckage. Not to prove any point to Nicole, but because building was simply what I knew how to do. A full year later, the commercial property was generating income above every projection. The business had grown to a team of 9 with a 10th hire scheduled. I had spoken at 2 industry events and been asked back for a third. I trained 5 mornings a week without a single exception. I had a real circle of people around me: Raymond, Daniel, a handful of others who had shown their quality during the hard months by simply showing up without needing me to perform being fine. I heard through the tangential transmission of mutual acquaintances that small cities always produce that Nicole had moved into a smaller apartment near her sister, that the baby, a boy, had arrived healthy, that Derek was completely out of the picture and had relocated for work, which was perhaps the only decent thing he'd done throughout this entire mess. That Nicole was managing quietly, with difficulty, but managing. I heard all of this the way you hear news about a country you used to live in. Registered it, noted it, moved on. There was a woman. I'll mention this because it happened and it was real. Her name was Claire, and I met her at an industry dinner. She was sharp and direct and laughed at things that were actually genuinely funny, and she had absolutely zero patience for performance in any form. We had dinner twice before I told her openly, and without any drama, what had happened with Nicole. She listened without interrupting once, which I deeply appreciated. When I finished, she said, "That must have been a very hard year." "It was the best year of my life," I said. She tilted her head. "How?" "Because I found out exactly who I was when the ground completely disappeared," I said. "That's the kind of information you genuinely cannot get any other way." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's either the healthiest thing I've ever heard or a very sophisticated way of not dealing with it. Which do you think it is? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. The first one. We were careful with each other. That was exactly the right word for it. Not slow out of fear, but deliberate out of genuine respect. She wasn't a rebound, and I made absolutely sure she knew it, not just in what I said, but in how I actually acted. Men who have been through real loss either become smaller or they become considerably better at the things that truly matter. I had worked way too hard on the second option to let it go to waste. The last time I thought about Nicole in any sustained way was on a Tuesday morning about 14 months after the party. I was signing documents on the commercial property refinancing, a significant deal, the kind that represented a real threshold in everything I was building. My attorney made a comment about how far things had come in a year, and for a moment, I saw the whole complete arc of it clearly. I had been a man with everything arranged neatly around a lie, living a life that felt stable because I simply hadn't tested the foundations. And then the foundations had failed spectacularly and publicly, and I had stood in the rubble with 2 pieces of paper in my pocket and made an absolute decision. I would not be diminished by this. I would not let someone else's betrayal become the defining chapter of my story. I signed the documents, shook my attorney's hand, walked out into a clear Tuesday morning, and called Raymond. The property deal closed, I told him. That's excellent, he said. I'll buy the first drink. You will, I said. I stood on the pavement outside the attorney's office with the sun directly on my face and the city moving all around me in the way cities do, indifferent and constant and absolutely full of possibility. And I thought I won. Not against Nicole, not against Derek, not against anyone out there, against the version of myself that could have completely collapsed under all of this, against the part of me that could have let betrayal define me, shrink me, make me genuinely afraid of what came next. That was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. I put my phone in my pocket and walked toward whatever came next without looking back even once.